it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?
Hi folks, this is Chris Gregory and this is Bob Dylan, A Headful of Ideas, Season 4. We're on episode number 8 now, and this is going to be Bob Dylan and Woody Guthrie, study of Woody's influence on Dylan's career. And it's called Bob Dylan and Woody Guthrie in the Grand Canyon at sundown, and this is Part 1. January the 20th, 1968. The crowd in New York's ornately furnished Carnegie Hall is mostly a respectable-looking bunch. Shirts and ties and iron dresses abound. The gathering has been arranged in honour of the recently deceased Woody Guthrie. Poor Woody had spent over a decade in various hospitals, suffering from the effects of Huntington's disease, an inherited degenerative ailment. In the meantime, his reputation as the godfather of American folk music had grown considerably, not least through Bob Dylan's very public patronage in his early career. Now the faithful are gathered to pay tribute. The cast of players is star-studded, featuring many of the major figures of the American folk scene. Most of them, as you would expect, use acoustic instruments. Judy Collins delivers highly spirited renditions of So Long, It's Been Good to Know You, Deportee and Union Maid. Richie Havens sings the haunting Vigilante Man. Tom Paxton brings his sweetly ironic tones to Pastures of Plenty. And the great historical bum, rambling Jack Elliott, performs the children's song Howdy Doo-Doo. And Pete Seeger performs the charming ditty Curly-Headed Baby. Odetta lends her powerful tones to Ramblin' Round before leading the climactic sing-along chorus of, naturally enough, This Land Is Your Land, that closes the show. That's Woody's most famous song. In between the acts, Hollywood actors Will Geer and Robert Ryan, who were friends of Woody, read extracts from his writings. There's little doubt, however, who the main attraction is tonight. It's the first time Bob Dylan has appeared in public since his epical 1966 tour, and few of the audience know what to expect. He had recently released the laid-back John Wesley Harding album, but this will not give him any clues to the nature of this performance. Towards the end of the first half of the show, he shambles on stage in a grey suit and open-neck shirt, his wild 66 locks shorn. He now sports a short, rather stringy beard, giving him the appearance of an itinerant preacher fallen on hard times. He really did look like that in those days. Behind him, 5 similarly attired musicians line up, mostly dressed in black. Within a few months, the band's first album, Music from Big Pink, will be released. But for now, these musicians are more or less unknown to an audience which is, like the rest of the world, completely unaware that Dylan, supposedly recuperating from a motorcycle accident, has been writing and performing literally hundreds of songs with them in a secluded location in upstate New York. It's only 2.5 years since Dylan's infamous appearance at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965. The culture of popular music has experienced a revolution since then. No objections by the folkies to the appearance of backing musicians are expected this time. No booing and so on, or shouting Judas. The 3-song performance could be said to be a kind of declaration of peace with the folk community, who he had stirred up so much in recent times. Yet, this is being done on Dylan's own uncompromising terms. It's no impromptu performance. The arrangements have clearly been worked out in detail, and the band's timing is immaculate, as always. The music is loud and uncompromising, subjecting 2 well-known and 1 obscure Guthrie numbers to the full band treatment, although it is arguably more nuanced with more light and shade than the full-on attack with which these musicians, minus the now-returned drummer Levon Helm, presented on the 1966 tour as they railed angrily against anti-rock protesters. It's still somewhat disconcerting, however, to hear this material rooted as it is in the culture and politics of the 1930s and 40s as rock music. The music hints at the dazzling eclecticism which will distinguish the band's first 2 albums. Dylan's delivery is highly committed and impassioned. The grand Cooley Dam, an exuberant celebration of a giant construction project, is distinguished by notable interjections by Garth Hudson on organ, while the lyrics celebrate American industry and endeavour during World War II, describing the dam as one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. The song reflects the expansive Whitman-esque patriotism that marks much of Guthrie's work. The band's 3 singers, Richard Manuel, Rick Danko and Lee Von Helm, provide sterling vocal support on the rousing choruses. I Ain't Got No Home is a very angry protest song that dramatises the plight of an itinerant worker during the Great Depression. It does not stint at criticising the authorities. The chorus runs, "Police make it hard wherever I may go." Dylan thoroughly inhabits the persona of the dispossessed narrator as he attacks the song with venom, making sure every word is heard. This is partly possible because amplification has improved considerably since the 1966 tour. The dominant instrument is Manuel's piano. Robbie Robertson plays a fluid guitar solo towards the end of the song, which concludes with another stirring harmonic flourish that emphasises the singer's desperation. Dear Mrs. Roosevelt is the most surprising selection. This extraordinary tribute to the late American president was never recorded by its author. It pretends to be one of the many letters that members of the public wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt, perhaps the most politically active First Lady, certainly up to her time, who had campaigned actively against racism and poverty. She was also a devotee of folk music, and thus perhaps a fan of Guthrie himself. The song is a kind of love letter to the president who, despite being struck down by the fever of polio, guided the US through World War II and whose New Deal economic policy is said to have helped America recover from the Great Depression. Dylan treats the song with absolute sincerity. He sings more melodically here, pacing himself carefully, with the band again supporting him on the chorus. This world was lucky to see him born. And it is really quite a remarkable performance. It's still only available on a record that's probably very, 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 very hard to get. Although I'm sure, as usual, you can find it on YouTube. Yes. Song to Woody is one of just 2 Dylan compositions on his first album, which was released in 1962. He's described on the sleeve notes as a country blues singer. The rest of the material on this incendiary debut tends to confirm this. The album features hard blues in the form of Blind Lemon Jefferson's See That My Grave Is Kept Clean, Bucko White's Fixing to Die, and Blind Willie Johnson's In My Time of Dying, and Curtis Jones's Highway 51. There are also more light-hearted blues-flavoured songs, such as Eric Von Schmidt's Baby Let Me Follow You Down, Jesse Fuller's You're No Good, and the hillbilly blues number Freight Train Blues, along with spirited takes on traditional American folk songs like The House of the Rising Sun, Pretty Peggy-O, Gospel Plow, and Man of Constant Sorrow. It's perhaps surprising that no Woody Guthrie covers actually appear on the album, given that in concert Dylan had been up to perhaps a year before this, was doing whole shows of Woody Guthrie numbers, and he seems to have learned vast numbers of them. But Dylan's own Talking New York uses the talking blues format that Woody popularised to give a jaunty account of his own arrival in New York City in the icy cold winter of the previous year. I froze right to the bone, he tells us, and then borrowing a little from Chuck Berry after a rocking, rolling, reeling ride, that's quite hard to say, he lands in the place that he deliberately mispronounces as Greenwich Village. Already he sounds quite cynical about attitudes to folk music in the coffee houses as he gets turned down by one proprietor who says, "You sound like a hillbilly, we want folk singers here," implying that he is expected to then play the then popular commercial and often bowdlerised form of the music, which had brought some success to groups like the Kingston Trio. Hillbilly music was a popular name for country and western, which the proprietor appears to be implying isn't real folk music. Dylan then describes how he gets a job playing harmonica for $1 a day. In the penultimate verse, he explains how he finally gets a better paid job in a larger venue, having joined the union and paid my dues. This is a nod to Guthrie, who was a lifelong committed socialist. The following lines do not mention Woody by name, referring to him as a very great man who once said, "Some people rob you with a fountain pen." This is a direct reference to Pretty Boy Floyd, one of the many Guthrie songs Dylan had been performing in the clubs. There's a fantastic version of this that Dylan recorded many years later in 1988 for a tribute to Guthrie and Lead Belly album. And look, I'm sure you'll find it on YouTube, but do check that out. Talking New York could hardly be called a protest song, but already Dylan has taken on Guthrie's satirical tone, laced with cutting, humorous asides. He relates a similar tale in Hard Times in New York Town, unreleased until 1991, in which he refers to the mighty many people all milling all around. They'll kick you when you're up and knock you when you're down. In these songs, Dylan adopts elements of his mentor's biography. Talking New York begins, rambling out of the Wild West, leaving the towns I love the best. In Hard Times in New York Town, he refers to the smog in California and every bit of dust in the Oklahoma plains and the dirt in the caves of the Rocky Mountain mines, as if he himself has lived a life of rambling like his hero. In his first ever radio interview with Oscar Brand in October 1961, he deliberately embellished this entirely mythical life story. And here's the dialogue. Dylan says, "I was raised in Gallup, New Mexico." Oscar Brand, "Do you get many songs there?" "You get a lot of cowboy songs there, Indian songs, that vaudeville kind of stuff." "Where'd you get your carnival songs from?" People in the carnival." "Do you travel with it or watch the carnival?" "Traveled the carnival when I was about 13 years old." "For how long?" "All the way up till I was 19. Every year, off and on, I joined various different carnivals." Bob, of course, is lying through his teeth here, isn't he? In a much longer radio interview with songs on Cynthia Gooding's show Folk Singer's Choice in February 1962, Dylan continues to maintain that he did work in a carnival for 7 years and had rambled around the country collecting songs from various blues singers. As you do, of course, if you're a 13-year-old white boy from Minnesota. He'd begun to construct this fantasy identity during his first forays into performing in the coffee houses of Minneapolis in 1960. That's when he adopted the name Dylan instead of Zimmerman, and hiding the fact of his upbringing in a respectable middle-class Jewish home. Later that year, he was introduced to Guthrie when a friend lent him a copy of his autobiography, Bound for Glory. Bound for Glory is a very wonderful, wonderful book, and if you haven't read it, you should go out and read it immediately. It's a real classic. It's a prose extravaganza, including scenes of Guthrie travelling in boxcars with fellow Okies during the ecological disaster of the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, and experiencing with them the prejudice faced when they arrived in California to work as fruit pickers. Guthrie's free-form prose was in many ways a precursor to the novels of the beat writers, especially Jack Kerouac's On the Road. In its careful mixing of truth and fiction and its colloquial style, it is also a clear precursor of Dylan's equally fanciful Chronicles Part 1. All accounts of this period describe how after reading the book, Dylan became obsessed with Guthrie. Soon his set list became dominated by Guthrie compositions. It seems that in order to impress fellow folk singers, promoters and fans, he adopted a Woody-like persona, even sometimes attempting to speak in an Okie accent. In early 1961, when he arrived in New York, he visited his hero in hospital. Later, he attended weekends in East Orange, New York, at the home of Guthrie's friends Eve and Mac Mackenzie, at which Guthrie was in attendance. During his initial run of dates in New York coffee houses in 1961, he had included many Guthrie songs in his shows. As his proficiency as a performer improved and developed rapidly at this time, he also adopted a similar vocal approach, delivering lyrics in a harsh and uncompromising tone that would set a pattern for his entire career. It's important to say, though, if you listen to Dylan has his reputation for singing like that, and if you listen to his albums, you'll hear very many variations in his singing style. Anyway, in the coffee houses, he also closely watched Rambling Jack Elliott, a performer whose style had been learned from Guthrie and adopted many of his vocal mannerisms, or you might say stole them perhaps. Woody Guthrie was active as a songwriter from the mid-1930s to the mid-1950s, after which he was hospitalised. During this period, he was extraordinarily prolific, composing around 1,000 songs, as well as travelling and playing with other leading folk artists, such as Pete Seeger, Cisco Houston, and Leadbelly. He was influenced by early country music pioneers like Jimmy Rogers and the Carter Family, as well as by many black blues singers. Politically, he leaned very much to the left, although there is no record of him actually becoming a card-carrying communist. But much of his writing was devoted to exposing how the poor in the USA were being exploited, most specifically regarding the plight of the Okies caught up in the Dust Bowl. He also composed a number of songs encouraging workers to join unions. After America entered the Second World War, he turned out many anti-fascist songs and even famously inscribed the much-imitated slogan, "This machine kills fascists," on his guitar. Wonderful thing to have written on your guitar, I think. It was probably only his illness that prevented him from becoming a victim of the McCarthyite witch hunts of the 1950s. At least he missed out on that. Among the Guthrie songs that Dylan performed in the coffee houses of Minneapolis and New York in 1960 to 61 were Jesus Christ, in which Guthrie recalls Jesus as a hard-working man who was put down by the bankers, Pastures of Plenty, a highly poetic expression of the plight of Okie fruit pickers, Ramblin' Round and Hard Travelling, in which the narrator explains his travelling man persona, Pretty Boy Floyd and Jesse James, both songs romanticising outlaws, and a plethora of children's songs and talking blues numbers. Whereas later in his career, Dylan will be fond of heavily rearranging his cover versions, he generally treats the Guthrie songs with reference, imitating his arrangements and vocal style. An exception to this is his treatment of Guthrie's most famous work, This Land Is Your Land, which is often treated as a flag-waving sing-along anthem. And this was Dylan's first major concert in the Carnegie Chapter Hall in November 1961, which has thankfully now been released on the Bootleg Series Volume 7, No Direction Home. This reading is slow and mournful, as he makes absolutely sure that the audience understands the song's stark demands for equality and freedom. Yeah, again, I'm sure you find that on YouTube. Live at Carnegie Hall, 1961. Very much worth checking out. It's a wonderful rendition. Arguably Dylan's greatest rendition of a Guthrie song. Many of Dylan's early songs are Guthrie pastiches. Talking Bear Mountain Picnic Massacre Blues, one of the compositions which led to Dylan becoming known as a songwriter, borrows not only its melody but its overall structure and lyrical style from Guthrie's Talking Merchant Marine, an account of his wartime service as a sailor. Dylan was clearly influenced by Guthrie's songs about contemporary events, many of which included thoughtful philosophical twists, often expressed with sardonic wit. Pretty Boy Floyd, which Dylan recorded a memorable version of for a Guthrie Leadbelly tribute album in 1988, concludes with, "I ain't never seen an outlaw drive a family from their home," thus identifying the bankers and capitalists as being much bigger villains than a mere outlaw. In Dylan's Only a Pawn in Their Game, he identifies a society that created Medgar Evers, his murderer, as the real villain rather than the murderer himself. With God on our side, he concludes by asking the perhaps unanswerable question, did Judas Iscariot have God on his side? So I'm going to leave it there, and we're going to continue, not to exhaust everybody, and we're going to continue this next time in part 2. Part 2, yeah, so see you then. Bye.
Is it rolling, Bob? Is it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?